Mệt quá không vậy?
Mệt chứ.
Dạ không sao. Ủa mọi người
Không
xạo
mệt.
không mệt đâu thầy. Thường có người thuyết trình mệt thôi chứ mấy người dưới có làm. Không sao lại có người thầy.
Chứ cái ngày cuối cùng mà chỉ có một nhóm thuyết trình thôi đúng không?
Dạ đúng.
Nên là hơi bị lạc lõng đúng không?
Hỏi người ta làm bài xong chưa, bóc người ta lên là phải hỏi người
ông nói là bài xong chưa luôn đi.
Nhóm cuối cùng là nhóm em.
đúng rồi.
Rồi bà làm chưa?
Mới làm xong bài này rồi là tối nay về mới làm bài
Vậy cho bà. Bắt bà làm luôn.
Vậy bà làm mình.
Vậy bà
Thứ năm
làm
bà đi
luôn.
học một mình. Nhóm bà đi học thôi.
Vậy là coi như là vẫn là ngày cuối là chỉ có một nhóm thuyết trình đi ha. Rồi.
ngày cuối em dồn cho ngày thứ tư là ngày mới thôi.
Ngày buổi chiều.
Đúng rồi, còn bây giờ ngày cuối của mình đây là ngày thứ năm đúng không? Nhưng mà là chỉ có một nhóm em thuyết trình thôi, đúng không ta?
Dạ đúng rồi, đúng rồi.
Ngày mai là có 2 nhóm rồi.
Ba nhóm.
Thì để coi ngày mai mình làm thêm cái gì.
Lấy bát rồi.
5, 6, 7.
Mai có còn mai.
Mai 2 thôi hả?
Đúng rồi, 3 bài thứ tư á, chỉ có một bài là thứ năm thôi.
Vậy là tổng cộng là 4 bài chứ.
Thì mình đã xong được 5 bài rồi đó.
Đúng rồi, xong 5 bài. Đúng rồi, bà thử. Ít nhất là 3 bài, 2 bài đó. Chỉ còn bài cuối cùng của bà Tiền thôi. Mình thử để số 5 bài được rồi này.
Ủa thầy nếu mà ngày cuối dồn vô ngày thứ tư là ngày thứ năm nghỉ hết rồi.
Thứ năm là đi lý thuyết, đi bài tập đồ.
Năm bài cũng được, 5 bài.
Tức là coi như là ngày thứ năm là mình giải mốc việc xem rồi coi lại mấy cái chủ điểm chẳng hạn. Nhưng mà không sao á, ví dụ như thứ năm một nhóm thuyết trình vẫn được mà. Chỉ là không biết là mấy bạn có muốn dồn lên để cho nó xong luôn cái một thuyết trình không thôi.
Mọi người có đi học không? Có ai coi em quyết định không? Hay là có mình nhóm em cái xong rồi có em nói
Dồn cho xong luôn đi thầy.
tự em nói tự nhiên.
Không, tại vì đúng là bây giờ mà dồn lên thì mấy bạn mình cái ngày cuối là phải chuẩn bị đúng không? Tại vì nếu mà muốn ngày mai á là bao nhiêu tối nay các bạn phải làm rồi. Tụi em nó chưa làm.
Đúng rồi này, không sao đâu, mấy nhóm khác chưa có làm.
Hai nữa mày
Vậy
khai.
tối nay tụi em dắt dò với là dòm thứ năm lên như
Ok, mà nói chung là cái này mình sẽ cố gắng là nắm cái ý chính của cái bài thôi chứ không cần phải học.
là cái phần 2 là nó sẽ đỡ phức tạp hơn cái phần 1 nhưng mà ý là thầy nói là nó sẽ
Phải là quen rồi.
Đúng rồi, tại vì thứ nhất là các bạn cũng đã quen với lại cái
Bạn đang đi à?
approach rồi, cái
em
framework
thấy cái
rồi.
của em tới 59 like rồi. Ủa 59 em
Cái gì nó
Không,
chính.
cái độ khó của bài của em.
Có nhiều cái bẫy thì nó
từ từ con đi tới rồi con
Mấy bài ngắn cái sổ, mấy bài ngắn nó viết nó tắt hết bây giờ.
Rồi xong rồi chắc là cũng có khi là buổi cuối thì mình cũng sẽ nói các bạn ví dụ như là những cái mà cần chú ý, tức là các bạn cũng không có cần phải học thuộc hết cái paper nhưng mà có những cái nó rất là quan trọng, ví dụ như là cái paper đó là address vấn đề gì nè đúng không, cái question của là gì, rồi những cái biến quan trọng là gì, kiểu như vậy. Còn không thì giờ là nhóm nào thuyết trình bài nào thì gửi cho thầy 5 câu hỏi với 5 câu trả lời để mà làm một cái pool question.
rồi khỏi cái trường đó thầy.
Không, là tức là tự
Sao
cái đó là lấy ra làm mà một phần của bài thi đó thì là đỡ hơn đúng không? Đó, nhưng mà các bạn thuyết trình 2 bài thì vô thì chỉ được trả lời 1 trong 2 bài các bạn thuyết trình thôi. Các bạn sẽ phải chọn một bài còn lại của 7 cái bài kia đúng không mà các bạn không thuyết trình.
Ủa là sao em chưa hiểu lắm.
Tức là mình có tổng cộng 9 cái paper đúng không? Mỗi nhóm là đã thuyết trình 2 bài rồi. Thì lúc mà vô thi á thì các bạn được quyền chọn 2 bài trong 9 bài đó để trả lời. Ví dụ như riêng về cái phần mà liên quan đến paper thì là các bạn được quyền chọn 2 trong 9 cái paper để mà trả lời. Nhưng mà trong 2 cái mà các bạn chọn là chỉ được một bài là các bạn đã thuyết trình thôi. Còn cái bài còn lại là phải chọn bài của nhóm khác.
Là thầy có một câu hỏi cho các bạn luôn.
Bây giờ thầy có rồi nhưng mà tại hơi khó nên bây giờ mình kêu các bạn là giờ các bạn muốn không các bạn tự đề xuất câu hỏi, tự đề xuất câu trả lời, nhưng mà tất nhiên là thầy phải có cái ưu điểm nha. Tức là thầy gửi chắc là gửi mail cho các bạn đi.
Đề xuất câu trả lời không đúng rồi.
Không, tất nhiên lúc đó thầy phải sửa lại, đừng có phải sửa lại nữa. từ bây giờ ra mà thì nó cũng sẽ ít nhiều là cũng sẽ gọi là có cái ý đúng đúng không?
hỏi là
Đó.
Kế học
chủ đề
Thì đó sợ mấy
Đầy
bạn
đủ
thôi
thôi
mà
mà.
nếu mà các bạn tự đưa câu giống như mình có cái full question thì các bạn sẽ có thể là catch được một vài cái, nhưng mà cái đó chỉ là một phần trong cái đề thi thôi. Đề thi là có vừa những cái câu khác rồi và vừa có cái liên quan tới paper nữa. Thì nếu mà cái paper mà các bạn có thể trả lời được thì là cũng ok rồi. Ok, nhưng mà mình có cái idea gì cho cái nội dung của cái phim đó không? Ok, vậy thì mai các bạn mặc đồ đẹp nha.
Không có độ
mọi
báo
người school em ra được không? Em cũng có đồ đẹp.
Vậy nữa hả? Giờ không kịp luôn hả? Không, cái này chỉ là quảng bá cho ngành cho khoa thì quay á. Thì không gì thế, mình quay nội dung mình học trên lớp thôi. Chứ không có gì hết. Ai muốn hiện diện nhiều, ai muốn có nhiều sóng thì liên hệ với lại Linh để sắp xếp được những cái cảnh nào có hiện diện mặt của các bạn. Còn những bạn còn lại không thích lên thì mình quay cái lưng thôi được không? Lưng nhiều vô là được đúng không? Lớp đông chứ lớp mình nhưng mà chắc là sẽ có cách để quay đúng không em? Thì ngày mai chắc là một số bạn lên diễn lại cái nét thuyết trình đi. Ok không? Bạn nào tự
Nếu mà
không?
mọi người ngại thì ngày mai có một bạn họ ảnh lên không?
Vậy nữa rồi sao khỏe rồi, khỏi nói lo gì hết.
Hay không ngại lên là
Thì cũng ngại nhưng mà thôi kệ, phải làm cho quảng bá cũng nằm trong mình chịu khó xíu thôi.
Nhưng mà cái lịch ngày mai á là mình sẽ như nào để em nhắn mấy bạn nhét cái giờ đó vô?
Ngày mai thì thầy tính là cho các bạn là sẽ có 3 bài thuyết trình này đúng không? Là sáng chắc là sáng 2 bài, chiều là 1 bài. Rồi mình cover sơ là chắc là có thể là mock exam hoặc là mình phải đi cho xong mấy cái chủ điểm chính của mấy cái concept này. Nhưng mà quay là kiểu như là quay trực tiếp từ cái mà mình làm hay là kiểu như là sẽ quay lại hoặc là một cái gì đó nó ứng với nội dung cụ thể, nó không có spontaneous được đúng không?
Phải có nội dung cụ thể là chứ mình học cái gì mình cứ thấy đó thôi.
Ok.
Ví dụ mà là bài thuyết trình đó thì cái là bài thuyết trình sau á thì mình có thể dành ra 2 phút hoặc là 3 phút để ví dụ như mọi người mà không muốn lên hình á thì em đã kêu bạn họ ảnh lên nó phải đúng một quá trình.
Ok. Rồi, ok được. Phải là nội dung này nọ viết. Nhưng mà viết mấy cái này thì em nghĩ là lên hình có được không, hay là phải viết đẹp hơn, mình phải
Dạ không vậy là đẹp là thầy.
đó mình phải viết nhiều thì mình viết kính hết 4 cái bảng đi. Viết kính hết 4 bảng luôn xong rồi chụp hình thấy không? Là thấy lớp là quá trời là kiến thức rồi. Rồi ok. Giờ ai mà muốn lên hình thì nhớ liên hệ Linh nha. Nha Huy.
em không muốn lên này.
Em muốn
Em
lên.
không thích mấy này lại cái em không muốn gây ảnh hưởng cho thầy thôi, chứ không phải em không thích mấy cái này. Với lại lần nào cũng không có được báo trước với thầy nên cái bị ghét không thích cái chuyện đó. Nhưng mà sao em không muốn ảnh hưởng tới thầy thôi.
Vậy là coi như là báo trước là để chuẩn bị đồ để trang điểm này nọ luôn á hay sao?
Thì để coi nó như thế nào á thầy. Chứ không đôi khi người ta đăng hình này kia của mình không
Khóa
biết.
sau mình cũng có hoạt động này á anh.
Thì kệ khóa sau chứ
Khóa
khóa sau thì sao?
cái môn sau á thì nếu như mà anh muốn nói thì em sẽ
Anh không đồng ý lắm á, ý là mấy này sẽ ra mấy lần.
ý là em nói để nếu mà anh thích thì anh cho thôi chứ.
Anh chưa bao giờ. Anh chưa bao
Không
giờ
sao,
cảm
không
thấy.
sao hết. Cái này là tình nguyện, cái là tự nguyện thôi á.
Tự nguyện đúng không em? Ok. Cảm ơn em. Đã nói bao nhiêu lần rồi, ngày nào cũng vậy. Sorry thầy.
Mấy lần trước là quay gì hả em?
Dạ không, ý là mấy lần trước chỉ là mọi người học xong á, xong rồi cái ngày cuối cùng thì lên chụp hình với thầy thôi. Dạ, tức là chỉ chụp hình giống như là mình tiện thì mình làm thôi á thầy. Còn năm nay thì tụi em muốn là chuyên nghiệp hơn á, nên là cũng có mấy bạn trong đội kiểu quay chụp như là bạn đẹp ở bên Bachelor nè. Dạ với lại nói chung là cũng đa số là sinh viên Bachelor của khoa mình.
Ok. Rồi. Là mấy bạn quay cho bên Bachelor hay là mấy bạn ở đây quay cho môn của mình?
Tức là trong team marketing hiện tại á, là sẽ có 2 bạn
bachelor muốn hay sao? Anh chưa thấy lớp mình muốn chuyện này lắm. Ý là em nói em muốn nè, lớp các bạn bachelor muốn.
Trong cái bạn mà quay phim cái team marketing của trường á thì là có 2 bạn sinh viên đang là của bachelor.
Dạ đúng rồi.
Ừ. Thì hôm bữa là thầy Đạt cũng có hỏi thầy thì mới biết. Ừ. Hình như vậy. Hình như là hết mình hãy nhớ hồi nãy em nghe chuyện đó. Có gì mình nhớ hay sao?
Mà bạn bảo hẳn là em vừa học thử mà vừa hỗ trợ cái công tác
Vậy là bạn đã tính vô học ra khóa sau 2026.
dạ chắc chưa rồi.
Ừ.
Như là bạn hiện đang học 24 nhưng mà kiểu là sắp tốt nghiệp xong rồi cũng có nhiều cái định hướng như là không có biết là cái nào phù hợp với mình hơn.
Ừ.
Nên là đang ở cái giai đoạn là thử nghiệm với lại
Mình nghĩ là nếu mà dựa lên coi trước của chương trình rồi như thế nào á thì mình cũng dễ đưa ra quyết định hơn đúng không?
như học học ở lớp mình thì học số lượng ít thì nó sẽ khác với lại đại học tại lớp mình sẽ biết
Ừ. Bachelor thì ở Việt Đức là cũng lên tới 100 mấy nữa, lớp lên tới 150 bạn rồi. Rồi thì dạy một lớp là các bạn lên tới 160 là đi về phía này luôn. Còn nếu mà riêng về này nè thôi là cũng đã tầm chắc cũng phải 70. Ừ.
Cái hồi khóa 2020 của em á là nguyên lớp BBA cộng với BFA có 90 là thầy. Còn thầy em là BBA là 67, còn BFA là 23. Còn lại vừa đủ 90.
Ủa sao BFA có 23
Đúng là như vậy, thầy em cũng rất là bất ngờ.
ok. Rồi em cứ tưởng là thường tại vì cái ngành đó là ban đầu bắt đầu sẽ là từ SA là bây giờ thành BFA á. Xong rồi sau đó
Hoặc là em nghĩ là có khả năng là cái thời điểm mà 2020 á là các bạn BBA với BFA khá là tương đồng nhau, nhưng mà kiểu như tới năm 3 là anh được khác nổi từ ngành này sang ngành kia, tại vì 2 năm đầu là học chung với nhau mà thầy. Vì bắt đầu là từ học kỳ 2 năm 3 á,
rồi
là được chuyển đổi để học cái môn thi á thầy, em nhớ như vậy.
ok. Môn thi thì là BFA là buộc phải học PhD.
Dạ đúng rồi, thi với BA.
Rồi ok là cái mấy bạn còn muốn mấy bạn mới đổi qua PA đúng
Dạ
không?
đúng.
Ok.
ngành là học riêng thôi. Còn thực ra năm tư thì học môn tự chọn thì trong lớp cũng có cả BBA lẫn BFI mà. Từ khóa 2022 trở đi đó thầy là mới có cái chuyện là sinh viên buộc phải học tối thiểu là 3 cái môn mà chẳng hạn sinh viên BFI là bắt buộc 3 môn elective là phải có finance trong đó, chứ từ khóa 2021 cho về trước là được tự chọn môn tự chọn luôn, tức là không có cái ràng buộc nữa.
Vậy
Đó nên là có thể nói là BBA với BFI hai cái môn mà có thể nói là tách biệt là chỉ là cái môn pi nữa.
Nhưng mà vậy là bây giờ là có còn được đổi không em? Hay là
em nghĩ là được.
ok, là coi như tới năm 3 bắt đầu chọn vẫn được đổi đúng không?
Dạ đúng rồi, kiểu như mình thấy là mình học mấy cái môn như là kế toán chi phí gì đó mà cảm thấy như là mình không có hợp với mảng tài chính kế toán á, thì được đổi sang quản trị kinh doanh. Còn những bạn học quản trị kinh doanh mà cảm thấy mình không hợp để làm quản lý gì đó thì có thể chuyển sang BFA.
Ok. Chờ chứ thầy thấy mấy bạn BBA thì thấy nhiều BFA vẫn ít nhưng mà trở thành mấy bạn ít. Mà thấy mấy bạn rất là ngại mấy môn finance luôn á. Không biết là có vấn đề gì không thì không biết. Tại vì thầy cũng mới vừa về cho nên là sắp sửa là thầy dạy một cái môn PT. Còn 2 môn viên trước là của thầy OM. Lúc em là có học thầy OM chưa ta?
Em có học thầy OM, em học vào cuối năm 3, đó là tháng 6 2023 cũng là cái lần đầu tiên mà thầy OM sang Việt Nam để dạy môn PFIN, thì là cái môn tài chính doanh nghiệp mà corporate finance đó. Thì thực ra thì lúc đó thì em cũng cái cách dạy của thầy OM hơi gắt kiểu rồi đó.
Ok.
Và tính đến nay là năm thứ tư của thầy OM tại trường rồi.
Thầy OM có các bạn như sau em á là ăn nguyên một combo 3 môn phiên của thầy OM nói luôn.
Yeah.
Nói chung là thi khó mà đúng không? Thầy OM thầy nói là cho thi khó.
Thầy OM cho take home exam á thầy.
Vậy hả? Ok. Take home exam thì khỏe
Nhưng mà
hơn.
họ nói là kiểu thầy OM cái lần đầu tiên mà em học cái môn với thầy OM là thầy cho mấy cái quiz á thầy giống kiểm tra 15 phút rồi đó. Rồi thầy OM cũng kiểu như là thầy gọi ai là người đó phải trả lời được cái kiểu đó, thầy gọi random á. Kiểu như cách dạy của thầy hơi gắt và thầy đặt nặng cái vấn đề tương tác á. Nhưng mà thực ra các em khóa sau thì có nhận xét như thế này về thầy OM, thì chính vì thầy OM gắt như vậy nên là sinh viên mới chịu học.
Ok. Ngại gì cũng được đi chứ các bạn nhiều khi trong lớp cũng thụ động mình không có biết được là các bạn có nắm hay không mấy em.
Rồi kiểu em nhớ những cái tiết học đầu tiên mà thầy OM sang người rất dạy á, kiểu như là thầy cho 4 cái assignment đó thầy. Chẳng hạn thầy cho cái assignment gồm khoảng 12 cái bài tập đi, là sinh viên sẽ làm lên trên giấy A4 rồi khoảng 2 ngày sau sẽ nộp cái tờ giấy A4 đó cho thầy OM để chấm điểm. Rồi điểm của môn cái đó thầy sẽ là trung bình cộng của 4 cái quiz, 4 cái assignment với một cái take home exam. Tức là ngay từ môn học thầy đã đánh giá portfolio luôn rồi.
Ok. Rồi mà nói chứ học portfolio thì các bạn khỏe đúng không? Nhưng mà thầy thì cực đúng không?
Dạ đúng.
Chấm điểm nhiều mà cũng chết luôn á. Còn Thiên lần thì đỡ hơn.
Dạ đúng rồi, em thích mấy môn nào có mỗi cái final exam thôi.
Vậy á em. Trời chơi cái đó là liệu ăn nhiều đúng không? Ở cái này khó quá. Cái này khó quá là coi như là thôi luôn á. Nhưng mà nói chung không sao, sẽ tùy. Thì quan trọng là các bạn thích cái cường độ nào á. Còn thật ra thì thấy là nếu mà thi 90 phút á thì các bạn có thể là sẽ tập trung ôn học rất là intensive hơn. Okay, so let's say we return to the lecture where we stop yesterday. Yesterday I covered the introduction terms for you, right? And then we jumped into the papers. Now let's have a look at a few points we should wrap up for our let's say
concepts of instrumental variable and the panel data. Right, I will start with like conservative file because it's a condensed one that I call more or less I include intuition, right? And in the actual lecture slide, we will see formal derivation. Okay, so yeah, we talk about, let's say, the objective variable bias, and that could be observable or unobservable. If it's observable, we'll try to include that explicitly into our regression, right? And for the case of unobservable, let's say maybe ability, right? Ability is something that we could not really capture. People may say that how about using the IQ test? How about using the standardized test score like SAT or the likes, right? That to some extent is okay once in using that, but we have to make sure that the IQ or the SAT score is a good proxy for ability. What do we mean by good proxies? That here
IQ.
so here this is our ability, right? We want to make sure that education and you are uncorrelated, and also the so uncorrelated, right? So cov edu and u is different than 0, right? Then next, the of ability, or in this case we have the IQ, right? And U different than 0. Moreover, the ability variable and education, right? IQ has no effect on education. Otherwise, we are introducing an endogenous variable in a regression, right? And how about the, let's say, measurement error ME bias, right? We usually see incorrect, let's say, inputting of the variables, or when we collect the data, so probably the household themselves, they report incorrectly, imprecisely wages, right, in the survey. And of course, it's on purpose, right? Because if they report high wage, then they might be involved in some request of the tax authorities, and that might be errors due to the manual importing data to the system. Maybe that instead of 100, we input 1,000 or 100,000, right? Then we have an outlier in the data. Or that could be inconsistent use of the average tax rate or marginal tax rate, for example. And it's not, why do we care about this one? Because if one variable is measured incorrectly, it affects not only that variable, or let's say not only the coefficient attached to that variable, but all beta coefficient will be biased, right? And the sign, the magnitude will then depend on the correlation between our explanatory variables. And again, here, the third one, right? The third violation of our OLS is the simultaneity bias or reverse causality. We do not know whether wage leads to higher education leads to higher wage, or higher wage will lead to further education, right? When people earn like a certain level amount of wage, they tend to return to university to obtain maybe a master's degree or some postgraduate degree, right? To further strengthen their let's say, the potential to jump to a higher sea level, something like that, right? And not only wage education relationship, we think of firm profitability and the CEO incentives, right? Whether CEO has high incentive leads to higher level of profit for firms, or when firm makes more profit, it has a way to induce CEO to, let's say, exert higher level of effort, right? Or diversification and risk. And in general, these, let's say, these problems just reflect one very general one, that is a chicken and egg problem. What comes first? And to solve the three problems that I mentioned, cognitive verbal bias, measurement error, and reverse causality, we could use the IV, right, to solve or to address the issue. And as long as we make sure that the instrument we are using are valid, right? And we'll talk about later, very soon, the effect on the condition. We wrap up the conditions of good IV. And IV methods can be used to solve any of the described problems, because it's a general method, and basically when you look at the diagram that I show, it deals explicitly with the correlation of the regressor and the error term, right? And so if we find a valid IV, we could obtain consistent estimators when the error terms is correlated with at least one of the regressor. We need recall that we need variation in education, right? If you have like the data where education is exactly one number across the year, there's not enough variation and we could not really measure that. Therefore, we need variation in education, maybe people ranging, or let's say development education ranging from 1 to 3 to 13, 14, 15, for example, right? We need variation in education to identify the effect of education on wage. And suppose we could split them into two types of variation. The first one is good variation that is not correlated with you. And next, the bad variation, right, correlated with you. And we want to rule out the bad variation and keep only the good variation. And with the method, with the use of IV, we could explain the variation in education, but does not explain the wage. So basically, we are trying to review the good variation only. As in, two conditions must be met for a good or a valid instrument. We keep discussing about that. The first one is relevance. Relevance means IV is correlated with the endogenous variable. If it's not related, then we might face a problem, because now if it's not correlated, we could not really form a channel, right, to extract the good variation. The next condition is the exogeneity or exclusion restrictions. IV is uncorrelated with the error U, or in other words, our instrument has an effect on Y, right, through and only through the endogenous variable. So those are the intuition. I really hope that you could it retain your mind when you further read papers or you write your master thesis, or later your academic papers, right? So to visualize that, we have the instrument, right, that affects education, and then education affects wage. But there should be a direct effect of an instrument on the wage. The instrument has an effect on wage through and only through education. And what is a potential candidate for this instrument? And in the paper entitled Using Geographic Variation in College Proximity to Estimate the Return to Schooling by David Hart. The author is trying to answer one question: what is the return to one or more year in school? Right. The problem we face is the endogeneity. Basically, is unobserved ability. So people with high level of ability, probably he or she was born with, let's say, high IQ level, or they are quite good in processing with number, and that induces them to study or to obtain higher degree, for example, right? And instead of using the SAT or the IQ score, the author tried to come up with one instrument in which he used the college proximity. Basically, this is a dummy 0 or 1 that indicates whether a man grew up in the vicinity or in the radius, right, of a college. And to be more specific, the dummy indicates whether a man lived near a 4-year college in 1966. So if yes, then our dummy is 1. If no, then dummy is 0. And basically now we try to visualize that living to near a 4-year college will incentivize the student or incentivize kid to obtain high education. Probably they see people in the college that behave well, that are intellectual, and they want to, let's say, follow the path. And yes, when they obtain higher level of education, then the wage increases, right? And at the same time, it looks like living near a 4-year college geographically has a direct impact on my own level of wage, right? And that's why so far, if we draw this diagram, it looks like the instrument living near a 4-year college is a valid instrument. But still, we must check 2 conditions. The first one is relevance, and the second one is our exclusion, restriction. Right? We check if the 2 conditions hold.
Can I ask, we use 2 words with a data set that has the questions of what is the effect of 1 more of education? I
Yes.
just wonder, what if we also have someone who graduated from college, and they have a master or a PhD, still get kind of questions, meaningful in that sense, because they are much far away from the first 12 years of program. So,
What? I'm not quite sure if I get your concern. You want to, let's say your question is whether we should focus explicitly on student, or let's say people in class 1 to class 12 only, right?
I mean, for example, the why is still a lot of wage, for example. We want
Yes.
to investigate the effect of education on the wage, but do we still need the years of education there? We just calculated for 12 years. If someone exceed that, for example, they have PhD, master, something like that. So is it still meaningful? Because we say that 1 year more, but we have a lot of years after K-12, right?
Yes, I see your point. But let's say, if you create, if you split that into category of maybe high school and above high school, right? That is what you want? Only 2 groups, so you do not want to have an extra year.
For example, we usually have in the the highest level of education, we can say PhD, master, so that has a lot of values.
Yes.
For college, so we also have the years of education as well, and as another variable.
So, okay, so you wonder if we instead of counting the years,
Yeah.
we just use the highest level of degree one by head, 1 by of 10.
Yeah,
Is
yeah.
correct?
Yeah. Or we have to have both. I don't know right now.
Okay, I see. That, like the general answer would be like that depends, because the way we construct the variable will lead to different interpretation, right? For example, in the case, let's say if you do not use the years of education, then you might have to use the category variable, right? High school, and then bachelor, and then master. But that also imposes one immediate question, that probably the effect of having from high school to bachelor, that's very huge. But then maybe from bachelor to master, the effect is smaller, or even master to PhD, it will be even smaller, because why? So it might be the case that PhD might be suitable for academia, right? But for people in the industry, recruiters, they do not value the PhD that much, and we expect, right? And so I would say it's possible, yes, but then you have to keep in mind how you are gonna interpret that, because if you assume that, for example, you have 4 categories. High school is 1, bachelor is 2, right? Master is 3, and then PhD is 4. When you put that into regression and you run the regression, then your very first assumption is that the difference or the jump in wage from high school to bachelor, bachelor to master, master to PhD, they are the same. And if you do that, then you probably ignore a few dynamics in the, let's say, that different types of degree could bring to the, let's say, the income stream of the student, right? And that's why I think when we use the number of years or years education, to some extent, I would say that it's not that perfect, but still we could more or less average them out by the years, and it's suitable to use or to measure that in the annual data when you have yearly report of the income, for example. Okay, okay. So to apply the IV, we let's say to use the IV, we apply the 2-stage least square method, right? 2SLS. Basically, as we've been discussing from yesterday and also today, we first regress our endogenous variable on our IV and order control, right? In the first stage, then we compute the fitted value or the predicted values of education in the first stage. We use that as our independent variable in the second stage. We regress. Instead of using education, we regress now log wage on education hat, and the set of controls as similar to what we use in the first stage. We want to make sure that we control for the same set of variables in both stages, right? And we need at least one IV for each endogenous regressor. You could have 2, and when you have more than 1, then you could apply some tests to see which one is better. But if you only have one IV, then there's no way to know whether it's the best or not, right? Because there's no benchmark to compute. We have to rely solely on the first stage and on our storytelling, right? Then intuition. The fitted value, why do we have to do that? In the first stage, we compute the fitted value, right? We regress and then we compute the fitted value. The fitted value represents the exogenous component, right? Or in other words, what we want to find is the good variation in education that is driven by the factors that are uncorrelated with U. And for the here right in the first stage, all of the bad variation are captured by our error terms in the regression. So if Z is a valid instrument and exclusion restriction conditions are satisfied, it will give us a consistent estimate of all of the data right in our regression. And we check the two conditions, relevance and exclusion restriction. For relevance, it's quite straightforward because there are methods for that. We check the first stage statistics. For the case of one instrument, we usually look at if F is greater than 10 or if the T statistic right, of the coefficient in the first stage is greater than 3. Then so it suggests relevant instrument. And for the remaining requirement, exogenity or exclusion restriction, this cannot be tested. And this is where your economic training comes in. You have to find a good argument, right? Argument to explain or to tell us that why the exclusion restriction is not violated in the case. So that's the IV. It could be applied to various types of data. We have cross-sectional or time series, or we have panel data. And if we have panel data, there are more techniques we could use to deal with the endogeneity. For example, the key for identifying causal effect is to control for our confounding factors, right? And if these are observable, we could either use them as control variables, and if it's not observable, it's unobservable, we use the IV. And as we know that finding a valid instrument is challenging, and that's why sometimes one authors could not find a valid IV, and valid IV, then look at another way to deal with endogeneity, and that is the panel data, right? Panel data, we have not only one dimension, we have two. First, the unit, and then the time. And with the two dimensions, we could apply the techniques of fixed effect or random effects, or we could even use the pooled OLS to deal with that. So let's have a look at our panel data. Whether you have multiple observations per unit of observation, it could be we have n units and we have t observation, right? And we could exploit the fact that the same subjects or groups of subjects are observed repeatedly over time. And with this characteristic, the panel data could help you address the impact of time invariant, right, omitted variables, and this sometimes can be very useful, especially for variables that cannot be measured. We could think of it this way. For example, when you have a data set of banks or even people, right? We know that, let's say, previously we are worried that kids or children with high ability may have earlier achievement in life. But just because the ability that we assume to be, let's say, innate, right? So they were born with that. That means it doesn't change over time, right? That we just talk about the innate ability, right? But for the knowledge assumption, something like that, that could be measured. But for the, let's say, to deal with the innate ability that are constant over the year, that are time invariant, we could use the fixed effect model, in which we assume that there is one dummy that captures that innate variable for every single unit in our data set, and then we basically just ignore the fixed effect. It has a role of capturing the time invariant effect, and then the remaining one will be captured by your beta coefficient. We have potential difference, right? Potential applications that are fixed effect or random effect, and later we have the differences in our natural experiments. And I think that's an overview. Let's now switch to our proper lecture slide. Right? Where did I stop? Okay, so here. So for some parts that are related to your, let's say, economic training, I might not spend time explaining that. So you could check that at home. Here we discuss what are crucial, right? What are crucial to expand our understanding of the techniques we learn in class. So let's say I will talk about the multiple linear regression model, right? So previously, I think have we covered this one? Not yet, right? Okay. Maybe I would, let's see, we could briefly go through that so that you have some idea about the concept or the banking setting, right? Okay. So here are a few empirical facts related to growth and finance, right? And since the mid-1990s, the banking sectors and the financial markets around the world witnessed radical transformation. The banking sectors have ballooned in various dimensions. Asset size, the sectors have greatly increased the supply of private credit and expanded into new lines of business. Financial markets also have seen major innovation in the trading volumes of some product. Let's say we have like credit derivatives and the like, and especially the financial crisis of 2007-2009 has imposed the question of the benefits of financial innovation and leads to a less optimistic, more distinguished view about finance, right? So, in short, finance grew a lot, it innovated a lot, and after the crisis, we can no longer treat that growth as automatically beneficial. We have to question, we need to find some evidence, right, for the growth of our financial market. And here, let's look at the graph. In Western Europe and the US, the ratio of domestic bank loans to the private sector to GDP was relatively stable around 40% until only about 1980, right? So here, yes, to 1980s, and then the difference start to grow, and when the credit to GDP rises persistently, it signals that finance become more central in the economy, right? But it also raises one natural question: are we funding productive investment, or are we just funding leverage and asset booms later that could translate to a crisis or a collapse of our assets market? That is the mortgage market we experienced in 2007 and 2009. It originated in the US, right? And next, the size of domestic and foreign banks across Europe. Foreign banks, let's say presence can mean competition, but at the same time, it shows one aspect that beneficial, that is the risk sharing, right? It also means that shocks now could travel not within countries, but now it could travel across borders more easily. And that is the case of a shock in the German market, right? Translates to the Japanese branch in the US market. And the next graph shows the comparison of financial structure in selected countries. European countries and the US become more market-based through 1990s and more bank-based during 2000s, right? And it's measured by the ratio of stock market capitalization to bank credits to the private sector, right? And the shift towards the market was more profound in the US during 1990s. The shift to bank stronger in Europe in around 2000, and as a consequence, Europe and the US differ more strongly in their financial structure now than it was before. And even if both regions involved, they evolved differently, right? And this matters because crisis, regulations, and growth effects can depend on whether the system is market-based or bank-based. And for bank concentration in selected countries, that's the case of the European banking system, right? The European banking system has become more and more concentrated. And let's say since 2000, the proportion of a national banking system total assets held by its three largest banks has increased in all major Europe except Italy, right? So higher concentration can reduce competition and raise too big to fail concerns, right? For example, for the case of Deutsche Bank, right? In Germany before, so the German really had to step in to bail the bank, and there was also a plan to merge Commerzbank and Deutsche Bank so that the Commerz could rescue the Deutsche Bank, right? But in the end, the merge plan was failed, and still Deutsche Bank now still operates to some extent, but it's not as effective as before. And Commerzbank, unfortunately, after the deal announcement, they have been, let's say, experiencing some reduction or some criticism from the public, right? And their performance now is not as expected by investors worldwide. And so that's the problem of too big to fail concern. And also, for bank concentration in one country, it could amplify the systematic risk or systemic risk. It could also create the scale efficiency, right? And therefore, we should always ask which channel dominates in empirical, right? Empirically. And how about the bank resolution in the US versus Euro? The number of failed banks in the Euro, in the EU was relatively small compared to the US. Does it mean that the EU bank has fewer financial problems? Maybe, but national supervisors in the EU have been more reluctant. They are more skeptical, right, to shut down distressed banks than the supervisor in the US. And such regulatory forbearance may create the so-called zombie banks, and cause further problems. What can we learn from, let's say, these facts? This is a classic identification warning. Fewer failures in a banking system does not necessarily mean healthier banks, right? It could mean different supervisory behavior, supervisory decisions from the central banking system. And we now turn to the questions, what are the long-run returns on major asset classes? The reference might be the paper from Jonah and co-authors, right? The rate of return on everything. What is the core questions of this paper? What is the accurate real rate of return in the economy? Is it higher than the growth rate of the economy? And if so, by how much? And is there a tendency for returns to fall in the long run? Which particular assets have the highest long-run returns, right? And they answer this question using annual data on total returns for equity, housing, bonds, and bills for 16 advanced economies between 1870 and 2015, right, including the housing. And notice here that historically, many datasets ignore the housing side, but if households hold most wealth in housing, you cannot understand returns without it, right? And that is especially the case for, let's say, Vietnam, right? Because we know that people, investors, we do not have quite diverse channel to invest. We, let's say, we rely not only in the bank, or let's say in deposit to the bank. Other channels are, I could list, for example, gold, right, or real estate, right? And those are, I would say that if they are kept, the proportion are kept to a healthy or moderate level, that's okay. But if an economy relies too much on the housing market, then we might face the biggest problem. We learned about that in the case of, for the case of US, right? In the crisis where people borrow a lot to buy houses, and then the bubble burst, and then they have to suffer, and it translates to a crisis. Or think about China, right? The case of every day in China, they use excessive debt to fund their real estate projects, and now the government decided to let them fail, right? And we are always wondering whether like the investor in Vietnam, or at least the housing market in Vietnam, will face the same pattern in, let's say, as in China, right? And I guess you've heard multiple times about the case of Novaland, right? So they also rely too much on debt. They also have a pipeline of projects that are, how to say, some of them are successful, some of them are just on paper, some of them has been conducted like for 50%, and even for some project, their houses could not, how to say, issue the property certificate for the owner. And so we've been wondering whether the government will rescue Novaland. And so far, I think we got more or less some signal from the government that Novaland will be saved, right? At least for the next 5 years, right? So that reflects different mindset, different philosophy of the ruling party for each country. And so we never know when it will, or when the bubble will burst. But I must say is that if a country relies too much on real estate, and basically the market grows not in a sustainable way, but in fact it's just a channel for people to speculate, then in the long run we will trade off, I think, significantly for that. But let's see if that's the case for the future, right? And so next, I think we have a few key findings. I will just briefly discuss them, and we could move to the OS1. So, for example, here we have the housing, right? The global real rates of returns. Housing is the asset class with the highest long-term return. And this is surprising, right? If you grew up thinking stocks outperformed everything. Because we have like some very classical mantra when we invest is that if you buy a stock, you just leave it there, you do not trade, you basically you follow buy and hold strategy, you leave it there for maybe 70 years, right? And the stock will be 10 times larger, right? But it might not be the case for now anymore, since 10 times larger probably just enough to cover the inflation for us. It doesn't really reflect the growth, and probably now firms can easily, let's say, go bankrupt, right? And if you just hold the stock of a bankrupt firms, that also like a loss. And so, back to the question, if you think that stock outperforms everything, then when you look at this figure, you will feel quite surprised. And historically, housing combined, the first is the capital gains, and next, that is the implicit rent or the dividend like cash flow, right? And the third element, usually the leverage, right? If you borrow money from a bank to buy a house, you will earn some, let's say, extra, call it like maybe it's the tax shield, right? Compared to someone who just invests 100% to buy a house. Yeah. And then we have some macro findings, long-run macro finding, right? From the UK, and in short, the macro picture tells us that housing is great, but the micro evidence says once you subtract all the costs, what else? And we look carefully, the return might be more modest than popular narratives, or let's say, we will see that we do not earn high yield as the data show, right? So real estate and financial stability, what I'm going to say about it? In short, the big theme, the key message of this slide is that house prices are not just a housing market story, right? In fact, they are a combination of micro and macro size, macro financial stability, because right, it depends on our leverage, right? And when it deals with leverage, one must evaluate with a cautious attention. So how about the lending standard? The lending standard vary let's say differently across the Euro area countries, right? So Euro area countries, they have a stricter or tighter standards, right? And higher. Okay, so what about those points? Okay, so higher LTV and LGI means the household buy homes with thinner equity buffers, or they just have small amount of money, they do not have extra buffer for that, and they donate, or let's say they inject all it into buying a house, and they rely solely on or significantly on the debt or the leverage, right? And when household use extensive leverage to buy a house, it makes the system more vulnerable, right? A moderate house price drop can push many borrowers into distress, and that could lead to a domino effect across the country. And back to the question whether finance benefits society, you could check the papers from, let's say, Zinger's, right? For Journal of Finance 2015. Basically, even if the economists tend to say finance is a growth engine, the public is much more skeptical. The gap matters for first, policy, and second, the legitimacy, right? And Zinger's suggestion for economic profession, economists should acknowledge that their view of the benefits of finance is already inflated, right? And an industry does not pay $130 billion in 2 years if nothing is wrong. And the evidence further suggests that a component of finance has been pure the rent seeking, right? Our research should focus more on this one. Or in short, the author does not say that finance is useless, but indeed he's saying some parts of finance can help us first allocate capital, and some parts may extract the rent, right? And if we want to do research on economics or finance side, so it's focus more on good research, good policy, and good research and good policy usually try to separate the components of finance here. Okay. So post-crisis literature, whether we have too much of finance, right? In light of the recent financial crisis, so I think for now we still keep in mind that the crisis refers to the one in 2008, right? But what we've been experiencing over the past 2 or 3 years is quite hard to identify as crisis, and so far we call it a depression, right? Or a maybe some stagnation side of the economy, but still we should keep a close eyes on that, because the situation has been quite negative, and it's not improved over the years, but in fact we've been seeing like some negative effects like worldwide, right? And so let's say back to the question whether it's too much of finance. We learned something from the two slides that finance can be growth enhancing, right? It triggers or it fosters growth at low levels, but it will destabilize or rent seeking at a high level. And that's why we care about the identification and the causal inference when we conduct research in economics and finance. Okay. Just a few more left, let's check. So I think all LS is pretty short, so I'm trying my best to go through it. And so I also hope that you are familiar with our notation here, right? So we have OLS regression with more than one independent variable. So we have x1, x2 until xk, right? And we introduce also the error terms, the u. In fact, beta 0 measures the intercept of the straight line that we are trying to fit, and beta 1 to beta k are the slope parameters or the coefficients of our regression, right? And how should we, let's say the error term u, right, includes all factors that have not explicitly been included in the model, right? And we assume that u are uncorrelated with x1, uncorrelated with x2 until xk, right? That's one strict assumption. And what is the interpretation of the slope parameter? So beta 1 measure the expected effect of a change in x1 by 1 unit when holding x2 to xk constant. We call that we control for x2 to xk, right? Or in finance term, we usually see that holding other factors constant or ceteris variables, right? And to be more like in mathematical terms, this is the partial derivatives of the expected value of y when we take the first derivative of our expectation of y given order x, with regard to x1, right? And we have one very simple model, yi equals beta 0 plus beta 1 xi plus ui, right? And so for example here, what is the value of our coefficient beta 1? So this is actually the slope, right? That is 0.3. And the value of beta 0 is our intercept. So that is here, right? So it's 0.01. And what are our assumptions of our multiple linear regression model? So the first one is that they are linear in parameters. What do we mean by linear in parameters? That means we have like models does not have to be linear in the x variable. Basically, we allow for square terms or let's say quadratic terms, something like that. But it has to have the form of beta times x, right? So there is a linear relationship. And the assumption 2 is, we call it random sampling, right? And we assume that the data are drawn at a random sample size of n, or we call it like IID, identical and independently distributed. And that's why whenever we deal with an example, we always try to ask ourselves if this sample is first representative enough, or we are just collecting one group of people or one group of firms that select themselves in the sample, right? And the assumption number 3 is no perfect multicollinearity. What do we mean about that? So there are no exact linear relationship between the explanatory variables, including the constant. Or basically, if here we cannot write x1 as a function of all other x, right? And if that is the case, then xy should be dropped. In fact, we have different coefficient for x2 to xk. So no perfect multicollinearities. Yeah, here, so for example, one regressor is the multiple of another one. This condition is violated, right? Assumption number 4. This is quite strict that we reached. We required the zero conditional mean of the error term. What do we mean by conditional mean? That means we take the expected value of our error given or conditional on x2 to xk, and the expected value of u should be 0. For any combination of the x variables, the error term has a condition expectation of 0. In other words, in expectation, the data points lie on the true regression line. That means now everything should lie on the red line, right? The OLS. Basically, the expected value of y given xy to xk now becomes beta 1 plus, or beta 0 plus beta 1 x1 plus until beta k xk. Remember, this one is crucial for OLS assumption that helps us guarantee the unbiasedness and the consistency of the OLS estimator. So basically, we know that our beta coefficient is unbiased. We are measuring the true coefficient of the variable. And assumption number 4 will be violated if u is correlated with one or several of the regressors. So we talk about that in the internal validity session, right? And then assumption number 5, we talk about the homoscedasticity. Basically, the variance, let's say of u given all the x is sigma square, right? So sigma square here does not depend on I. That means they are constant, right? The error term has a constant variance conditional on the x variable. So let's have a look at our at the illustration of our homoscedasticity. So example to the left, we know that for like our distribution of beta 0 plus beta 1x is the variance is sigma, right? And it's similar for all of the distribution, all the data point. But here to the right hand side, we see that sometimes the variance is small, but sometimes the variance is very large, and sometimes the variance might, or let's say the distribution might be skewed, polarized. And so that's the case of heteroscedasticity, right? And so that means now we could write formally the definition of heteroscedasticity. That's where the variance of u given x1 to xk is different than sigma squared. Or in other words, the variance now differs across different observations. And under heteroscedasticity, the OLS estimator remains unbiased, consistent, and asymptotically normal, right? That means the distribution converges to normal distribution under the law of large number and the central limit theorem, right? However, our coefficient now, or our estimator now, are no more efficient, right? Which means that it has a relatively large variance. And in empirical practice, this loss in efficiency is typically accepted. Or in other words, when we run the regression, we are basically we are facing one trade-off, that is between whether it's unbiased or whether it's efficient, right? So sometimes we know that maybe I will draw it. I will draw it here for you. Let's say, let's assume our coefficient beta so this is our true parameters. We call it how to say, maybe just beta true, right? It should be maybe 0. No, maybe 1, right? So beta true equals 1, right? Now, when we, let's say in practice, when we have equal beta, and the choice of model usually put us in a tough decision, we have to face the trade-off, right? Right, so whether this is unbiased or versus efficient, right? So assuming that this one is beta true is 1, and we have 2 students coming up with 2 different results. The first one is here, maybe beta 1 hat, that is so beta 1 hat 0.5, right? So this is our estimate. He or she come up with this estimation. So we know that now beta 1 hat is quite different than the true beta, right? Why? But this model actually returns to a distribution that has low variance. So we remember that the case of statistically significant, right? When maybe we say that here, (95% of the time we obtain the estimated beta 1 that is significantly different than 0, right? This is 0.5, and within this shaded orange area, we know that this is different than 0. But the student may come up with other models. He or she tell you that, hey, 0.5 is actually bad. I could do better. My model could predict 0.9, right? Let's say here we call it beta 2 hat, or we call it maybe 0.99, very close to the true model. But what's the problem? Here. The variance now is super large. Right. That means despite having a very close estimate, right, to the true parameters, but now the variance is quite large, and I cannot conclude that beta 2 hat is statistically significant than 0, right? Or even if, let's say, now I think I make it too extreme, or let's say now, because if it is insignificant, then a different story, but maybe now here. It's still statistically significant. But now you see that the range or the confidence interval is much larger than the one above, right? So this one better, or let's say closer estimated to the true parameters, but the variance is quite large. And that's very much now depending on the trade-off, which one or the researcher want to use. Sometimes they say that, okay, I would like to choose beta 1 of 0.5. That's okay, as long as I know that beta 1 hat could, let's say, fluctuate in a very small range. But for the case of 0.99, I think it's way too large. The confidence interval now ranges from maybe 0.1 to 2. It's way too large, although it's unbiased, but still I don't think that it is safe for me, right? So people will decide which one they prefer, depends on their preference or the trade-off they want to take, right? But I think so far from my experience, or so from what I observed, people rather choose the one with, let's say, low variance, right? I mean, it's more efficient because unbiased could be dealt with, but when it's inefficient, the variance is way too large, then there's it's more challenging to deal with, to tackle the problems. Okay, good. Then I think we call it the day, and tomorrow we come back at 9:30, right? And so if you want, we could make like today 2 paper presentation in the morning, and then another one in the afternoon. Or you prefer covering the topics in the morning first? Then we push all of the discussion and paper preparation to the afternoon. Totally up to you.
I prefer to have 2 presentation
So how about other student?
Yeah. Because we will be the paper 5, the 6th. We will be the presenter of tomorrow.
Ah, okay, I see. So yeah, so 2 in the morning and another one in the afternoon, right?
So we do paper 8 in the afternoon, so no change for us. If that's okay.
Yes, that's totally fine. So that's okay for you, right? Because I think the or you could discuss among each other which one first. I don't mind. Yeah. So as long as the paper that set for tomorrow, we will just keep it. And so for those, I'm not quite sure, but just let me know if you want tomorrow the paper on Thursday, right? If you want to present tomorrow too, that's totally fine for me, right? But again, no pressure. If you need more time, then we'll just keep it as planned. Okay. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so see you tomorrow.